begins today, although most are starting to celebrate it tomorrow. In the Muslim world, it's sort of like their high holy day, in a sense. It'd be like Easter in the Muslim world. So it's called the Festival of Sacrifice, or if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Eid al-Adha. Now, one thing I want to note that because today is also September 11th, there are many Muslims who are very nervous about celebrating. Because it's based on a lunar calendar, it keeps changing actually as to which date on the Gregorian calendar it actually falls on, and unfortunately it falls on this year on September 11th. So please watch out for our Muslim friends out there. Eid commemorates, interestingly enough, when Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Ismail. But remember our story, right? It's a little bit different from the Jewish story, the Jewish Christian story. Here Ishmael goes willingly and knowingly to be a sacrifice. And his father Esau asks him, what do you think about this? And he's like, yeah, I'm fine with it. It was sort of an interesting reaction. But remember that as a Muslim is someone who submits to God. That's what Muslim means, one who submits. And part of that is being celebrated by Abraham's willingness to put his faith in Allah as well. So on this holy of holy days, being celebrated today, Muslims go around the world and they do a sacrifice, right? Because remember there was a ram that appeared automatically and they did that sacrifice. So they sacrifice a cow or a ram or a goat and they give it to the needy. So 1/3 of it goes to the family, 1/3 for friends and neighbors, and another 1/3 goes to charity. Now I don't know about you, but I had never heard of this before. And I consider myself actually pretty well versed in world religion, so this came as a bit of a surprise for me when I heard about this. And where are all these cows being slaughtered? I've never seen this before. Obviously, it doesn't happen much here in the western United States when we don't have as much Muslim farmers out there that have cows, sheep, and goats. So most of them donate to charities and distribute their goods to the poor. For example, they might go to a shelter or something like that. But around the world, about $3 billion in US dollars worth of beef, mutton, and goat is being distributed in the next few days to needy families. And it's not just anything. All the livestock have to actually meet very certain criteria. You have to give your best. Only the best is offered. And you think that if you think, by the way, that $3 billion worth is a lot, which it is, I just want to point out that in the United States, we spend about $150 billion a year on beef alone, not even including mutton and goat. But I have to admit, this idea of sacrificing cows was a little bit unnerving for me. I like my beef in nice, neat packages, personally. I think that this idea of sacrifice, in American culture, it makes us a little uncomfortable. Because if we take sacrifice, literally, right, that's the slaughtering of animals in a ritual, it feels sort of barbaric or even repulsive, particularly if you're vegan or vegetarian. If we take sacrifice more figuratively, that is the notion of giving up something for the benefit of others, it feels less repulsive, but we tend to think of it more of it as like a gift that we give people. Well, I want to explore this concept of sacrifice that Gandhi believed was needed for any religion to be a true religion, because he believed that sacrifice had to do with love, compassion, and understanding. And when I first heard the story of Isaac and Abraham, right? This is one of my favorite painters here, Caravaggio. And this thing, I actually pictured poor Isaac, just in horror being, about to be sacrificed by his father, right? Not the sort of nice one in the Muslim world which says, yeah, sure, Dad, no problem. But then he was forced to do this, and it's a terrible thing. I mean, I think I heard about it at age 10 when your sense of fairness comes in, and I just remember thinking, you have got to be kidding me, right? I didn't understand it at all. What kind of a God would test someone like that? And what kind of a parent would allow a God to do that to their child? And what kind of a God then also demanded sacrifices anyways? I mean, God was supposed to be omnipotent, right? All-powerful. What had a God in need of bloody entrails or meats or grains? It made no sense to me. And as many of you know, I grew up with an atheist father and an agnostic mother. These parents, they took a very dim view of Christianity, and they felt that the church was all about controlling people, and so the idea of Jesus being sacrificed for our sins, boy, that did not sit well with them at all. So when Christianity was actually explained to me, not by my parents, I seem to remember it was a friend of somebody, can't remember, I was told that I should be grateful to Jesus because he voluntarily went to be sacrificed so that I might have eternal life. And again, being 10 years old, right, you're like, wait a minute. You question everything. I just remember my first reaction wasn't gratitude, it was, well, who asked him to anyways? I didn't ask him to do that. And I actually literally felt resentful. I was supposed to feel bad about something that I had nothing to do with. And since I knew I was also a pretty good kid, I didn't feel like I needed any saving. So really Jesus, when it came to me at least, he sort of sacrificed himself in vain. I didn't think anybody really needed it. It seemed ridiculous to me. And so that word sacrifice has always had this sense to me of something that's silly or repulsive or barbaric. And it's an old world that belongs to old religions that no longer pertain to this modern world. But luckily I grew up, and I've come a long way since then. And I've embraced a lot of the wisdom of Christianity, in particular around the ideas of love, right? To me, what Jesus called the highest commandment is that we love God, love our neighbor, and ourselves, right? That means I do my best to help those on the margins of society. I do my best to love even those I find somewhat unlovable, particularly when they don't think like me. And I do my best to help those in need. So do love and sacrifice have anything in common? What is sacrifice? One thing to remember about sacrifice is that it's a very ancient tradition, beginning all the way back into pagan times, long before the desert religions came along. And during that time, this was a time when God was not sort of a doler out of morality. Really, that was the gift of Judaism to the world. God wanted us to be good people. Other pagan gods really didn't care if you were necessarily good people. They just wanted their sacrifices. These gods were more human and capricious than we think of today. They doled out their beneficence to those they liked because they weren't all powerful. In fact, a god could be killed in the ancient world. So their power had to be used sparingly, lest they use too much of it and be defenseless against other gods. So how you got a god to like you was by giving gifts, sacrifices. And life being the greatest gift was considered the greatest gift back to a god. So gods gave to you and you gave to them, and it was this mutually beneficial relationship. And to this day, we call the giving of life even the ultimate sacrifice. And one of the things I remember wondering as a child was, well, what happens to all these sacrifices out there, right? The bulls, the cows, the goats, the birds, the whatever, the grains, the fruits. God doesn't actually eat them, right? You put them on the altar, what happens to them? Well, it turns out that's actually a fair question. When talking about sacrifice, we forget that one of the main reasons people did this is that those goods usually went to support those who were in need. Some of it might have gone to the temples and the priests or priestesses, but some of them went to those in need. None of it was wasted. And sacrifice was not only mutually beneficial between an individual and a god, it was beneficial to the community, the distribution of wealth in a sense. And that's exactly what happens on the festival of Eid. Those who can afford it sacrifice their best cow, goat, or sheep, and they celebrate with their family and neighbors, and then they give the rest to charity. So when did the sacrifice become kind of a dirty word? I know that many may be repulsed by the idea of so many animals being slaughtered for sacrifice, but this idea of giving up wealth to benefit others is really at the heart of what sacrifice is all about. And we do it here every single Sunday, right? We call it an offering. Each week we take an offering here at the church. Now, I'm happy to say you all don't sacrifice goats, cows, or sheep, but you do give of your wealth, right? And it doesn't just support this church, though half of it does in the offering that we take. The other half is given to those in need. We say half of it goes to those who share our values, and that's pretty cool. And this church, if you aren't aware of this, it gives away each month about $750 every single month to our organization. That's pretty cool. And you know that our churches, we aren't wealthy. We struggle with our own finances. We struggle sometimes with making payroll for the staff. We sometimes struggle with how we're going to keep the building up and everything. So we sacrifice our collective monies to go to others because we know it's an act of love. To give to others to help make the world a better place, it's part of our calling as Unitarian Universalists. When we ask people to make a pledge, right, that's our annual donation to the church we ask people to give, We aren't asking people to give up their home, little Janie's college fund, or to cause themselves harm. We ask people to give in love. That is, to give to the church and themselves and those that they care about. We ask people to give until it gives them joy, not pain. Love is a deeply important concept for us as Unitarian Universalists. Love is not just a feeling, it's a verb. It's an action. It's how we strive to be in the world. It's that love, compassion, and understanding that Gandhi is talking about. But if we aren't careful, even sacrifice for love can get us in trouble. And we can think that it has to mean we have to give everything, or that ultimate sacrifice. One of my favorite Unitarian Universalist theologians, she and a colleague of her wrote a book called Proverbs of Ashes. Her name's Rebecca Ann Parker. And she points out, she originally is Methodist, and she says that women have been taught that they need to be like Jesus, to be a sacrifice. That is, women are often taught to sacrifice their needs and wants for the greater good of the family. Now, men are often too, but for women, this in particular can be deadly. For example, women, she says, if in an abusive marriage, were told by many ministers and priests to sort of simply take it. That is, they were called to suffer for the sake of the love of their family, just as Jesus suffered and died for all of us. So the dangerous message of Jesus as sacrifice is that it glorifies suffering, and that suffering is somehow redemptive of our sins. And how is that loving of a loving God? How is that about loving your neighbor or yourself? You guys remember the story of the giving tree? We did it a few years ago here. Some of you may know this story, right? Story of the giving tree, this sweet little story of a tree that loved a boy. And at first that was mutually loved with the little boy, but as the boy grows, he asks more and more of her. First he asks for her apples, then the wood from the tree, until finally she's just a stump that he can sit on. She has sacrificed everything for him. And for many women, this story is considered love, that the giving of everything you are is love. That's also one definition of codependency. Many people believe that sacrifice is about giving up everything, that it asks more of you than what you really can or should give. But that really isn't true. Sacrifice should be based in love, but it's not a one-way street kind of love. Remember that sacrifice was something that was mutually beneficial. And Christianity tells us not only to love God and our neighbor, but also ourselves. And we seem to have sort of forgotten that piece of wisdom from Christianity. Sacrifice must be based in love for ourselves too. As I said, not just a one-way street. And what about those terrible stories of Abraham attempting to sacrifice his son? Well, one thing is we have to remember to put these stories in their context, to see these stories as a history of humankind's understanding of God. And during the time of Abraham, child sacrifice was not uncommon in early Semitic cultures. What is remarkable, scholars point out, is not that God would require a child to be sacrificed. That was not unusual. What is remarkable is that God stops it and says it's not required. In other words, this story is actually about a cultural shift. God does not ask you to give up your life or the lives of those you love, because God is a loving God. Love has a role to play in sacrifice, but we have to remember that it has sort of three parts to that love. And I think it can be summed up very well in the Christian tradition, right? If you can forgive me for the Trinitarian reference as Unitarians. So you think of love of God, that greater good, where you want to call it justice, you can call it goddess, you can call it family, whatever you like. There's love of neighbor, right? That's your community, and the love for yourself. All that is needed to be balanced. When we're out of balance as a culture and as a person, that's when we get in trouble. And it isn't to say that there aren't times when we sacrifice more to one than the other, but the key is balance. And if you find that your life is out of balance in this, you might be in a little bit of trouble there. And originally, this is what sacrifice was about. It helped everyone. Now, we Unitarian Universalists, we often look down on other religions because their rules and their rituals, citing them as meaningless. For example, those 7 deadly sins of Christianity, right, that Brunetti sort of scoffs at. Or there's also the 10 Commandments of Judaism, or the rituals of sacrifice in Islam. But what each of these rituals and rules are about, at least originally, wasn't about hurting or repressing people, but about trying to form a better and healthier society where people loved one another and treated one another well. And worship or religion without sacrifice is deadly to a society because there's no community without some sacrifice. Religion without sacrifice asks nothing of people but to sit self-satisfied in the pews. Religion without sacrifice is self-serving. It doesn't require us to grow or to become better human beings. It doesn't ask us to make the world a better place for future generations. And for Unitarian Universalists, we have very little ritual, very little rules, very little that is required of you to be a member of a church, right? You sign a book, you get to vote, make a pledge as best you can. Our 7 principles are a bit like the 7 deadly sins in our reading today. In other words, they can be kind of watered down, somewhat ignored. They aren't rules, they're more like guidelines. But if we were to truly follow those principles, and if you want to know what they are, they're on the back of the handout you were given when you first came here, there would definitely be some sacrifice involved if we were to follow those. I think a lot of it would be sacrifice of our ego more than anything. So for Unitarian Universalists, for us, sacrifice is not required, so it has to come from a place of love. Love of God, love of our neighbor, love of self. This is the holy way of sacrifice, but it comes from a deep place of love and a desire to make a better world. May it be so, blessed be, and amen.